Today I'm going to tell you a story about a man. No, a legend. Someone who lit the fires of liberty for an entire continent. Someone who is so greatly revered in his culture that he has passed into the realm of the immortal. Hi, my name is Gabe Bauer, and this is Top Shelf History, where we combine great stories with great drinks. This is El Libertador. It is the cocktail, or cocktails I should say, inspired by the incredible life of Simón Bolívar, the man who lit the fires of revolution for an entire continent. The drink, or drinks, are made with orange juice and French vermouth, St. Elmo's fire liqueur and creme de cacao, banana rum cream, aguardiente, and blue curacao. All people have at least a few things in common. We all drink, we all eat, we all sleep, and we all make an impact on this world. But not all of us make as massive a geopolitical impact as to have a country renamed after us. That is reserved for the Simón Bolívars among us. Simón Bolívar was born into affluence in Caracas, Venezuela in 1783. His family was part of the Spanish colonial elite, making their money from mining copper and gold. The first few years of Simón Bolívar's life were great, but tragedy and heartbreak quickly followed. At the young age of 3, Simón Bolívar's father would pass away from tuberculosis. Only a few years later, his mother would follow suit. Now a very rich orphan, he'd be passed around from guardian to guardian, from aunts and uncles to his grandfather and eventually even his family's slave, Hippolyta. As Simón grew older, he would be taught everything a privileged young man would be. Under the tutor of Simón Rodriguez, he learned math, philosophy, science, and history, but he would be particularly taken by the ideas coming out of France, particularly with Descartes and Rousseau, the ideas of liberty, enlightenment, and freedom. And as Simón Bolívar grew up, he would grasp these ideas and shape a new vision for his country of Venezuela. He traveled to Spain to finish his studies, and he would be successful, even though he was a little bit distracted by meeting the love of his life there, Maria Teresa Rodriguez. And they would actually end up getting married over in Spain and then traveling back to Venezuela. And now with a new +1, Bolívar was ready to settle into his life of aristocracy and, being part of the colonial elite. But 8 months after getting off the boat, his wife would contract yellow fever and die. And once more, tragedy and heartbreak would fill Simón's life and also change it forever. Mourning his wife, he threw himself back into philosophy and politics and even traveled to France to see Napoleon's coronation. Since he esteemed history's famously short military leader, he wanted to go see this man who seemed to be the embodiment of secular republicanism. But upon seeing the Pope place the crown upon Napoleon's head and naming him emperor, Bolívar's heart broke a third time, because he realized that Napoleon had betrayed everything he purported to believe in. He was becoming a king again. Someone had to stand up for what was right, and he figured it would have to be him. So he met up with his exiled teacher, Simón Rodriguez. Yes, he was exiled to Europe after being kicked out of Venezuela, and the two ended up going to Italy. And upon the 7 hills on which Rome is built, Simón looked out and he had a new vision, a new passion for his country. He said, "I will not rest until Venezuela is free from Spain's control." And he would end up getting back on a ship and heading home to do just that. How, particularly, do you assume that a man would be able to go about that? Well, he was rich. So, money talks, and it buys you government positions. And the new Republicans that were forming a new government in Venezuela were happy to take his funds, even though they didn't really like Bolívar a ton. With Bolívar and the Republicans having signed their independence into law on April 19th, 1810, and having fully separated themselves from Spain, they would need some foreign help, at least for recognition and maybe even for some military aid. So Bolívar and his fellow Republicans traveled to the UK to muster up some support, a tactic which unfortunately didn't really work. You see, England had sided with Spain to fight Napoleon in Europe. So Bolivar's more brash personality and commitment to the cause didn't exactly evoke the most nuanced negotiations with the British emissaries, and they would end up leaving without any British support. But they were able to find someone else while in England. Bolivar came across a man named Francisco de Miranda, an old military mind, and Bolivar thought to himself, if I can't have the British, I'll at least take Miranda. And so Miranda boarded on the ship and came back with them to Venezuela to declare their new republic. But Miranda was also not exactly the best choice for the job. His military prowess wasn't exactly successful. There were defeats that were following one after another, and the people, the largely Catholic people of Venezuela, were starting to resent their more secular Republicans because things weren't exactly great. Morale was low, and they were starting to wonder if God was punishing them for leaving Spain. And then there was an earthquake, a massive earthquake, one of the biggest in Venezuela's history, and at that point, the people knew this was a failed republic, and it crumbled. And so Bolivar and his fellow Republicans realized that they would have to start from square one yet again. But this time it wouldn't be in Venezuela. Bolivar would travel instead to New Granada and try to begin anew. New Granada, modern day, is Colombia, and starting in the local towns, some of the bigger towns, especially Bogota, Bolivar tried to ingratiate himself with some of the aristocracy and the really rich people and see if there's any independent-leaning figures there. Then he would go to both the rich and the poor and try to muster up some support, something he really didn't do in Venezuela, which was paying attention to the poor. Next, he would actually get a small, I guess you could say, platoon to help guard an outpost against the Spanish, since the Colombians were kind of ready for their own independence. But although he was tasked with guarding an outpost, he wouldn't. Instead, he would go and lead one of perhaps the most exceptional military campaigns in world history. It was pretty amazing, fairly easy. As he went from royalist town to royalist town and somewhat ironically declaring it for independence, he also mustered up a lot of support and got more people to join his army. When he finally reached the border to Venezuela, some of the now New Grenadans, or Colombians, I guess you could say, stopped in their tracks and they said, well, that's not really our country, we're just going to stay here. And others said, no, we will press forward. And Bolivar, he was set on pressing forward. This was his home country. This is where it mattered. And it was also at this point that independence and the Second Republic changed for Bolivar. The fighting style changed. It became more of a war of revenge than a war of independence. He wanted to deal out the brutalities that the Spanish had given to his people back to them. And in doing so, he got new enemies and worse enemies, particularly a little group known as the Legion of Hell. And let me tell you, the Legion of Hell is putting it mildly. These guys were brutal. I'm talking like Vlad the Impaler brutal, with emphasis on impaler. So with infighting, new enemies, lowering morale, a whole lot of bloodshed, perhaps a war crime or two in there, the Second Republic also ended up coming to a close, and the Royalists ended up winning. Bolivar and his men just couldn't outlast their enemies. And he was ousted once again, but this time he couldn't go back to New Granada either. He would end up going to Jamaica. And it was in Jamaica that we saw another change in Bolivar's political frame of mind. He saw that where he had previously failed in trying to muster up support in New Granada and Venezuela to be independent in themselves, he realized that this is impossible, that they would have to unite all of the South American Spanish-speaking people under one central power. Does this start to sound familiar? Almost a little bit like an emperor. And detailing specifically these thoughts and sentiments in his ever-famous letter, A Letter from Jamaica, Bolivar was ready to press on forward, and except for the fact that he needed a little bit of support, both militarily and monetarily. And he went to Haiti. Yeah, Haiti fueled his third rebellion, or I should say his third revolution. And with the support of the Haitians, at least in guns and monetary funds, Bolivar and his men would re-enter in through New Granada and began a new campaign. First coming down from the mountains, much like Hannibal, and that's an incredible story. I'll tell you more about that later. He would first start by getting through New Granada, and then he would press on and liberate once again through Venezuela. And finally, this time, he would be successful. As Spain had infighting of its own, they realized that they just couldn't hold on to their colonial possessions. And at once, finally, Bolivar won. He not only freed Venezuela, he freed New Granada, and he freed Ecuador, and modern-day Panama, and Peru, and Upper Peru, which would rename itself as Bolivia. Yeah, they were that grateful. And he was the unquestioned dictator of them all. Kind of ironic, considering where he started. It was an accomplishment nonetheless, but despite all of that, Simón ended up dying alone, the lonely dictator. Kind of a sour end. But with that, I think we should get into our drink. Personally, I felt telling the story of El Libertador, or the Liberator, as Simón Bolívar is known in South America, very fondly, may I add, is that we can't just tell this through one drink or one story, really. I mean, his tale is so large and so incredible that I think it has to be told in stages, even in our drinks. And so, with each drink, with each shot, is a different stage in the independence of Gran Colombia, the country that was actually formed after the independence was actually accomplished by Bolivar and his fellow patriots. And for the first part of this drink, we're going to start out with the First Republic. It's very hopeful, and Bolivar is very brash. He's very idealistic, and he has all of these ideas of republicanism and everything that he's ever wanted. And so for that, I figured let's go with something bright and something that would make us feel hopeful. And for that, we're going to start off with orange juice, which we're going to fill about halfway up, maybe just a little bit more than halfway up, and then we're going to follow that up with French vermouth. Now, why French vermouth? Well, one, it's delicious. Two, it's French, and this is very particularly chosen because it was the French ideas of Descartes and Rousseau. It was the French Revolution that inspired Bolivar to be the idealistic man, that young man that he was, that helped push the revolution forward. And I think that this is an important point to play here in the creation of our drink. So we're going to pour that to the top. The second part of our story, and therefore our second shot, is much grimier, it's much dirtier, it's much harsher. It is that Second Republic in which we see the legions of hell and Bolivar's men. We see the brutalities of war in almost all of its ways come out. It's probably the worst part of Bolivar's life, and I felt that we need a drink that's kind of alludes to the harshness and the difficulties of having to go through that revolution for him. And so with that, we're going to use St. Elmo's Fire Liqueur. Now this is made by MB, forgive me, Roland. It's about 100 proof, so 50%, and it is cinnamon and cayenne whiskey. Let me tell you, this is so potent. So potent. We're gonna do that much, and honestly, that may be way too much, but that's okay. If you're at home, maybe give yourself a little bit less. We're going to follow that up with creme de cacao. Why? Because the flavors here are actually going to play a little bit nicer with the chocolate. Because when we're taking with cayenne and with cinnamon, we know that they're going to work with chocolate anyway, but particularly I'm thinking, okay, what flavors are going to work well with cayenne? And that's more like a mole type of version. Plus, in terms of color, we want to be able to evoke some of that grimy, dirty awfulness that is war that really was shown in the Second Republic, and there is that part of our story. But the final part of our story is the victory. It is that sweet coolness. It's everything that Bolivar had ascribed to be. It's everything that he wanted to be, I should say, is to finally see his nation be free and independent, and him being the unquestioned ruler of them all. And for that, I think we have to use some aguardiente. Now, aguardiente, for those of you who don't know, is a very well-known Colombian liqueur. It's made with anise. It almost tastes like an anise-flavored rum. It's translated to fire water, aka aguardiente. I'm using aguardiente Antioqueño. Antioqueño is just where it comes from. The biggest city, I believe, in that region is Medellin. And this is really, really good. It's almost like a watered-down anise-flavored liquor, and we definitely want to use that here. Because after all, for El Gran Colombia, we need some Colombian liquor. And that should be enough. Probably a little bit more than we need, but that's okay. Actually, I'm gonna pour out a little bit here into a little glass I have below. We're gonna follow that up with some banana rum cream, because after all of the war and horribleness that happened here and all the pain you're going to endure drinking this, you're gonna need some cooling down, and the banana rum cream is going to add some very necessary cooling sweetness that will be delectable. And finally, we're going to add some blue curacao, because in reality, the other thing I'm trying to do here is I want to show the colors of Bolivar's flag. I mean, after all, have you ever noticed with Venezuela and Colombia and Ecuador that their colors are similar? Well, that's because that was the colors of Gran Colombia. And so with our flight, it's to a degree close. Maybe you disagree, maybe you don't, I don't know. I think it's pretty close. We have our blue, we have our very, very dark bloody red, and we have our palish yellow. And with that, we have each stage, I believe, of Bolivar's life. And each one is very different, and each one will have a very different experience, but I think it speaks and is the only way that we give credence and respect to the man who freed almost an entire continent. I've talked a lot. Let's give it a try. We'll start off with his young life, because it's a good starting point. Yeah, that's good stuff. You know, it's so bright and it's so hopeful. I can feel the inspiration that is coursing through Bolivar's veins as he begins his first republic. But now I think it is time for the brutal fight. Let's transition to our second shot here. Remember how I mentioned war crimes? I'm feeling that in my mouth. There's literally battle happening in my taste buds. And oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble speaking a little bit. It's really good, actually, at the same time. The chocolate really helps, but the cayenne and the cinnamon is very potent. I can feel it in my ears. This is really interesting. But no, the biggest thing here is that it is a battle. This is a battle in a drink. This is a battle in a shot. You can feel the fire going through every part of your body. This will probably make you sweat. It's making me sweat. I think I'm ready for victory. Let's try the third shot. Oh. I feel like this is how Bolivar would have been after he finally secured independence. The fire is still kind of there. It's part of my history now, as it was a part of his history. But there's satisfaction in knowing that we have won. And that final drink is really, really good. I love the bananas. The banana rum cream isn't actually really too potent on the banana flavor. The aguardiente still is able to come through with the anise flavor. It's subtle, but it's not overpowering. And finally, you have the citrus play of the blue curacao, and I actually think it's a good complement. Perhaps not something that would be usually used in a shot like this, but I think really goes well. And trust me, after following up with the second shot, it's very necessary. But certainly a drink, I think, worthy of a man as legendary as El Libertador, Simón Bolívar. And that sounds like last call. So, Bolivar was successful. He freed almost the entirety of Spanish-speaking America. It's pretty amazing. Outside of like Argentina, the dude was just a beast in South America. He just went on revolution after revolution. And the key to his third revolution, or you could say his third republic, was funding from Haiti. And that's just fascinating to me. I mean, let's talk about that for a second, okay? Haiti was the first ever slave uprising that was successful in taking over an entire nation. It was like the place that all the slaves wanted to go. It was not only like defiant of the French power, but it was also a paradise in its own way. It was so cool. And when Bolivar ended up going to Alexandre Pétion, who was the first president of Haiti at the time. He requested aid in the form of any military or if in the form of any monetary funding, and Pétion said, sure, I'm about it, but here's the thing. In order for me to give you my support, there are going to be some conditions. And there was one particular condition that Pétion was interested in, and that was that Bolivar needed to free his slaves, and all the slaves, in the land that he was going to liberate. And of course, Bolivar sat there and said, yes, I'm about it, whatever you say, mister, I will absolutely do everything you just asked me. Just give me your money and guns so I can go and win a nation. And he would take his monetary funds and he would go to Colombia, and then he would also go to Venezuela and end up freeing an entire nation. And incredibly, Bolivar actually did follow through. He actually did liberate his slaves, although he did not necessarily liberate everybody else's. But it was an interesting little proposition that Pétion, in order for him to give the support to Bolivar, said, look, we just won an entire revolution getting rid of our slaves. In order for us to support you, you're going to have to back us up. It really showed the valor and the commitment Haiti had to abolishing the practice that had subjugated their people and something that they had to throw off without the support of anyone. And now they were able to export it to other countries. And even though it wasn't exported fully, it was exported at least partially. And that is remarkable to see. And it led to the independence of an entire nation and eventually multiple nations, as Gran Colombia ended up breaking up. But fantastic to know either way. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to check out any of our other historically inspired cocktails, you can find them here, or you can also find them at topshelfhistory.com. You can also find us at Rumble and Locals. Our Locals page is also our main community page, so if you guys want to be part of the Top Shelf community, please consider giving that a join. It's also the area where we can have our patrons, so if you're interested in getting some of our premium content like our after hours or even our behind the bar, then that is also a great landing spot there, and it would be fantastic for you guys to support the show. But know that we love you guys, and from everyone here at Top Shelf History, remember, history is better with a drink, or drinks. Cheers.